Milling is an unofficial term used to refer to sending cards from the top of the deck to the graveyard. So in this video, we're going to focus on cards that either banish or send the top cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard that can help enable a deck out, an alternate win condition where one player can't draw any more cards from their deck. And to start off this list at number 10, we have Gravekeeper's Servant, a continuous spell card which states that in order to declare an attack, the opponent must send one card from the top of their deck to the graveyard. This effect isn't particularly strong, since sending one card from the deck to the graveyard is something that every deck can do. So while it may be able to help stall out games and bring a mill deck slightly closer to deck out on every attack, it's likely that your life points are going to hit 0 before it makes a significant impact. And in the modern game, there are better options for stalling and trying to prevent attacks, such as Mystic Mine, which can stop attacks and monster effects entirely, so long as the opponent controls a monster. So how did Gravekeeper's Servant make it onto this list? Despite its limited use, Gravekeeper's Servant actually has one extremely strong aspect to it that no other card on this list has, and that is sending cards from your opponent's deck as a cost rather than as an effect. This means that unlike other cards on this list, Gravekeeper's Servant cannot be negated by cards such as Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, even though it's sending a card from the deck to the graveyard. It also means that it can permanently lock your opponent out of attacking if used with cards like Macrocosmos, which essentially states any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. And because the opponent wouldn't be able to pay the cost of Gravekeeper's Servant by sending a card to the graveyard specifically with Macrocosmos up, they wouldn't be able to attack at all. Although this card hasn't and is extremely unlikely to see competitive play. Its interesting interaction around with certain other cards was enough to make it on this list, especially since there aren't many strong cards that specifically mill your opponent's deck. So speaking of some more weak cards, and at number 9 we have one of the weakest cards in this list, Worm Worm. Worm Worm is a level 3 fire insect monster with an effect that simply reads that if it's destroyed, you must send the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. Now in the TCG, this card has never seen any competitive play, nor has it seen any play in any mill decks that have ever seen success, in part due to the fact that Worm Worm must specifically be destroyed in order to trigger its effect, but mostly because mill decks just have better options even if they don't specifically mill, such as the Jar cards or Trickstar Reincarnation. Where this card has seen success, however, and the reason why it's not dead last on this list is due to its historic play in mill decks and Duel Links, where deck sizes are much smaller and there are fewer removal options that don't specifically involve destruction, allowing for Worm Worm's effect to trigger more consistently. In the past, Worm Worm was often paired with cards like Assault on GHQ, which would destroy one monster you controlled to send the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard, meaning that if you destroyed Worm Worm, you would be sending 5 cards from your opponent's deck to the graveyard. It also paired alongside Hero Shadow Scout, as well as stall options to slowly deck out an opponent through the course of several turns, and was in fact hit on the Duel Links ban list in June of 2018, where Hero Shadow Scout was put to 2. Although, the reason why Worm Worm takes a spot at not Hero Shadow Scout is that Hero Shadow Scout technically doesn't mill, it draws the opponent's cards instead. And draw cards won't be on this list, as while they do deplete your opponent's resources and further milling out as a win condition, they themselves don't mill cards from their opponent's deck, so cards such as Hand Destruction and Dark World Dealings won't be on this list. Still, if you're planning on playing a mill deck in Duel Links, Worm Worm is a notable card to consider, but if you're playing the TCG or in Master Duel, Worm Worm should be avoided as there are much better options you can play, such as the next card on this list. And at number 8, we have Delg, the Dark Monarch. Delg is a level 6 monster with 2400 attack and 1000 defense, sharing this stat line with other cards in the Monarch series, such as Rise of the Storm Monarch and Mobius the Frost Monarch. In contrast to most of the other Monarchs, however, Delg does not need to be tribute summoned, and states that upon its successful normal or special summon, you can target up to 2 cards in your opponent's graveyard and banish them, and then send the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. With the main downside of the card is that it cannot attack the turn this card is normal or special summon. Usually, Monarch strategies don't take Delg the Dark Monarch into consideration, and alongside Grandmark the Rock Monarch, Delg is considered one of the worst monarchs in the game, though this isn't because its effect is bad necessarily. Even in the modern competitive scene, banishing is still considered a premium effect. So much so that cards like DD Crow, a hand trap that banishes from your opponent's graveyard, still sees competitive play, as it can deal with powerful graveyard effects during either player's turn, such as Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer or Water Enchantress of the Temple, despite it being a -1 in card advantage. Monarchs just usually have better options to summon, and most decks would rather use other cards like the aforementioned DD Crow to deal with those graveyard effects since it's much easier to use. Although because he mills, Delg the Dark Monarch can be used to further the win condition of milling out your opponent, while also dealing with some of the graveyard effects other cards have milled before your opponent has a chance to activate them. However, despite this card having a fairly powerful effect, it only takes the number 8 spot on this list, and due to how difficult it is to normal summon. Because it's a level 6 monster, it needs 1 card to tribute summon. Though, because its effect triggers on special summon, it is technically possible to use cards such as Reasoning to bring him out to the field. But in general, it is still pretty difficult to summon, especially for mill decks that focus on specific combos like Morphing Jar, or slower mill decks which are focused more on spell and trap cards to stall out your opponent. And being difficult to summon is something the Dark Monarch shares with the next card on this list. In fact, this card is arguably even more difficult to summon. And at number 7, we have the Earth Machine monster, Digvorzhak, King of Heavy Industry. It's a rank 5 monster that requires 3 level 5 monsters as materials, and has a pretty beefy attack stat of 3200. Its effect reads that once per turn you can detach one of its materials to mill 3 cards from the top of your opponent's deck. And if any monsters were sent to the graveyard by this effect, you can destroy cards your opponent controls up to the number of monsters sent. This is actually an extremely powerful effect, as not only does this effect have the potential to destroy any 3 cards your opponent controls, it also doesn't target, meaning that it can circumvent other cards which have certain protections, and still destroy them, making it a pretty effective card for clearing out the field. If you manage to hit 3 monsters, that is, as despite the card being a fairly powerful going second tool with a large attack stat, the effect to destroy 3 cards isn't at all guaranteed, especially against decks that are focused more on using high densities of spells and traps, such as control strategies like Eldritch or Guru, making Digvorzhak pretty ineffective against most back row decks. And furthermore, while this card can avoid targeting protection, the fact it destroys can also be seen as a downside, as cards that cannot be targeted are often also paired with protection from destruction as well, such as in the case of Dragoon or the Magispector cards. Still, if you manage to get Digvorzhak on the field, its high attack makes up for not having guaranteed destruction, and the card actually saw minor competitive play during 2016 in Cosmo lists, though it never really caught on despite its ability to wipe boards. And speaking of cards that are used to clear monsters, and at number 6, we have Sky Striker Maneuver Vector Blast, a normal spell belonging to the Sky Striker archetype, which has the relatively simple effect of just sending the top 2 cards of each player's deck to the graveyard. However, Vector Blast, like most Sky Striker spells, actually has a pretty strong bonus effect that states if there are 3 or more spells in your graveyard, you can shuffle all monsters your opponent controls that are in the extra monster zone into the deck. This is non-targeting removal that doesn't destroy monsters, bypassing virtually all protections a card can have other than being unaffected by card effects, acting as a fairly strong going second tool to defeat monsters that are usually in the extra monster zone. Cards like Appaloosa Bow the Goddess and Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf, for example. The fact that the card's Vector Blast sends to the graveyard also count towards its own spell count, and that it's easily usable since it's a normal spell makes it a lot more accessible compared to the other aforementioned cards, which require tributes or Xyz materials or even has a strong effect paired with its milling, especially since it's searchable by Sky Striker Mobilize Engage. Though Vector Blast never really saw any play in decks designed to mill at your opponent, and only briefly saw competitive play in some Sky Striker lists as a tech option, as other Sky Striker cards such as Afterburners or Widow Anchor, which is a little bit better, as not only could Afterburners and Widow Anchor target any monster your opponent controlled, it was also guaranteed to be a removal option, either through destroying the card or negating it. Vector Blast just didn't have the same utility. Although it's perhaps a fine enough card for milling decks when going second, it doesn't really remove too many cards from your opponent's deck, and it requires some setup to get 3 spells in the graveyard. But it does technically help you bring you closer to your win condition, even though there are much stronger options to use, even if they're less readily accessible, such as the next card on this list. And at number 5, we have the Zombie Vampire. The Zombie Vampire is a rank 8 zombie monster which can be summoned by treating one monster you control that was initially owned by your opponent as a level 8 monster, and it also cannot be targeted by monster card effects unless they were specifically special summoned from the graveyard. The Zombie Vampire, in contrast to a lot of the other cards in this list, actually sees play specifically because of its mill effect, rather than it being tied to a slightly more powerful effect. On a hard once per turn, you can detach one Xyz material from this card, and then both players will mill 4 cards from the top of their deck to the graveyard, which is already quite strong of an effect. But if any monsters are sent to the graveyard this way, you can special summon it to your side of the field. This can allow you to gain access to a lot of powerful monsters from your other player's deck, or even your own, while also gaining a lot of powerful graveyard effects. And if you're playing a pure vampire deck, you can actually use the monsters summoned from your opponent's deck as materials for other cards, such as Dhampir Vampire Shuridan, as like the Zombie Vampire, it can also change the level of an opponent's monster to match its rank. Although currently, the main reason why the Zombie Vampire sees play is for the ability to extend and mill your own cards, like in Dragon Link. And the fact it mills so many cards from your opponent is usually seen as a detriment, since it could allow them access to their own powerful graveyard effects. but the fact that it can mill so many cards and it has seen recent competitive play puts it at the number 5 spot. As while it's not really usable in mill decks, the card is still quite powerful, and if summoned in a mill deck would deal with a lot of cards in your opponent's deck. It'd just be harder to access when compared to the next card in this list. And at number 4, we have Soul Levy, a continuous trap card which has a really simple effect. You can only control one of it, so you can't combo it with itself, but while you control it, every single time your opponent special summons a monster, they must send the top 3 cards of their deck to the graveyard. At first glance, this card's effect seems no better for milling than a lot of the other cards on this list, and is almost comparable to Warm Worm in requiring your opponent to perform an action in order to make them mill. However, the notable thing about Soul Levy is that the card has no once per turn on its effect to mill 3, and because it's a continuous trap, assuming your opponent doesn't get rid of it, they're going to mill 3 cards every time they special summon a monster. Usually, special summon is something that most combo decks want to do, and as a result, Soul Levy actually has the potential to mill a lot of cards from your opponent's deck, and can be used as a stall tool to prevent your opponent from performing combos involving a lot of special summons. Otherwise, they could either mill an important engine piece, or mill themselves out entirely, which is likely why it has the stipulation that you can only control one of it, so that it's not milling 9 cards on every special summon by controlling 3. The only issue with this card is that despite special summoning being fairly common in the modern game, it still requires the opponent to continuously summon until they mill out, when they can just stop when they have fairly powerful monsters in the field to just attack with. Some decks rarely even special summon at all, which is usually true of control decks, though compared to combo decks, they're far less prevalent, meaning there's a good chance Soul Levy is going to do a decent job at milling, which is why it makes it the number 4 spot. At number 3, we have Necroface. Necroface is a dark zombie type monster that has the effect that resets all banished cards back into the deck, and then Necroface gains 100 attack for every card shuffled into the deck this way. Having a very similar effect to Grand Maju, this card can technically be used in a similar capacity to OTK your opponent, provided you get enough cards banished to shuffle into the deck, of course. However, the stronger effect of Necroface is that if it's banished, each player must banish the top 5 cards of their deck. This technically doesn't mill cards, but it has a similar effect and accomplishes a similar goal. And because it banishes, it's actually stronger than sending cards to the graveyard, as there are fewer cards in the game which gain effects that triggered when they're banished, compared to card effects that trigger in the graveyard, allowing for the main drawback of mill, accidentally activating your opponent's graveyard effects, to be avoided. Necroface also isn't once per turn, which really works in its favor because Necroface triggers when it's banished. If Necroface just so happens to banish other copies of Necroface, that second Necroface will trigger and banish another 5 cards from both players' deck, and then that Necroface can banish another, triggering its effect once more. Necroface actually combos quite well the number 1 spot on this list, helping to banish every card in your opponent's deck, but even by itself, its milling capability is quite strong, especially when paired with cards like Gold Sarcophagus or Macrocosmos to ensure it's banished. Or it can be paired with cards such as Virtual World Hime Nyanyan to shuffle back a copy of Necroface to hopefully banish it and banish another 5 cards later. And at number 2, we have Soul Absorbing Bone Tower, a dark zombie with the effect that, while you control another zombie monster, your opponent cannot target it for attacks, with its milling effect being that each time a zombie monster is summoned, you must mill the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck with no once per turn in sight. This effect appears somewhat similar to Soul Levy, even appearing weaker at first due to needing to special summon a zombie monster specifically, and only milling 2 cards. However, there's one key aspect that puts Soul Absorbing Bone Tower above Soul Levy, and that is that Bone Tower doesn't rely on your opponent's special summoning monsters, meaning that if the controller of Soul Absorbing Bone Tower can continuously keep special summoning zombie monsters on their side of the field, they can run through every card in your opponent's deck. There are a few enablers for this card. Book of Life and Mizuki are easy to access and can summon zombie monsters from the graveyard, but the real deck which can abuse Bone Tower was the Mayakashi archetype. The Mayakashi archetype is a zombie archetype focused on continuously special summoning Daki, the graceful Mayakashi from the graveyard, in order to synchro summon a Mayakashi monster from the extra deck, which are also zombies. And when a Mayakashi monster is special summoned from the extra deck, Daki also summons herself back from the graveyard. And because she's a level 2 tuner monster, and every Mayakashi synchros monsters is 2 levels apart, you can climb with Daki and a level 1 monster to Oboro Guruma, the wheeled Mayakashi at level 3, and then Tsuchigumo, the poisonous Mayakashi at level 5, to Tengu, the winged Mayakashi at level 7, going on and on, continuously looping Daki. Every single time Daki or a Mayakashi synchro monster is summoned, it will trigger Soul Absorbing Bone Tower's effect to mill 2 cards from your opponent's deck. And this could be done over 20 times, milling the opponent out of cards completely, essentially resulting in an FTK as the opponent wouldn't have cards to draw when it gets to their draw phase. Now, it is a little hard to set up the Bone Tower FTK, as it requires both Bone Tower on the field and the Mayakashi monsters, but with so many generic zombie enablers, such as Call of the Mummy or Double Summon, or even other Mayakashi cards like Yukimusume the Ice Mayakashi, who can set up the graveyard with Bone Tower or Mezuki, it's not as difficult as it may first appear. So it takes number 2 spot on this list, even if the whole combo dies to simple hand traps. And at number 1, we have Inferno Tempest. This is a quick play spell card which can only be activated when you take 3,000 or more battle damage, and when it does activate, it banishes every monster in both players' decks and graveyards. This is a relatively simple effect that removes most cards from your opponent's deck, and is actually relatively easy to trigger. And unless your opponent is playing a heavy back row strategy, your opponent is likely to have banished most of their deck. Especially in the modern metagame where most decks are comprised of majority of monsters thanks to most hand traps being monsters. In the past, there were some decks that took advantage of Inferno Tempest using a card known as Grinder Golem, which gives your opponent a 3,000 attack monster and 2 0 attack tokens with the idea that you could attack Grinder Golem with one of these tokens to trigger Inferno Tempest. In the modern game, however, Grinder Golem is banned, though not for this reason, but because it gives you 2 tokens which can be used for link summoning. That doesn't mean it's impossible to trigger Inferno Tempest on your own in the modern game though. The Kaiju archetype has monsters which all share the summon condition that they can be special summoned to your opponent's side of the field by attributing one of their monsters. And this can work on unaffected monsters, like the Arrival Cyberstatic Nixter or Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus. And then, you can just attack into that Kaiju with 3,000 or more attack to trigger Inferno Tempest. The main issue with the card is that it doesn't banish spell and trap cards, meaning that unlike the Soul Absorbing Bone Tower mill, which can mill every card in your opponent's deck, Inferno Tempest can't completely deck out an opponent, unless their deck is entirely all monsters. So why does it take the number spot on this list above Soul Absorbing Bone Tower? Because Inferno Tempest banishes all monsters from both players' decks. This means it can be paired with the previously mentioned Necroface to banish the remaining spell and trap cards left in your opponent's deck. Add in one Virtual World Hime Nyanya and you're guaranteed to mill even the most monster-light decks out there. Alright, and that's the list. You'd be surprised at how few cards exist that actually are designed to mill your opponent's deck. If you know of any other mill cards that were designed to help mill strategies, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, let us know down in the comments.